Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a great morning. I hope you got to attend some of those early sessions. I know the sessions so far have been awesome. It's been really cool hearing your feedback about them as well. So we're excited to have you here for our first keynote. Somebody who we're very excited and somebody who knows the Notre Dame family very well, John Paul Lederach. So I will introduce John Paul and then I will let him take it away because he has got an awesome conversation coming up. John Paul Lederach is a senior fellow at Humanity United and professor emeritus of international peacebuilding at the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He works extensively as a practitioner in conciliation processes active in Latin America, Africa, Southeast, and Central Asia. He is widely known for the development of culturally appropriate approaches to conflict transformation and the design and implementation of integrative and strategic approaches to peacebuilding. He served as the director of the Peace Accord Matrix Research Initiative at the Kroc Institute and is an active member of the Advisory Council for the recently formed Truth Commission in Colombia. He is author and editor of 24 books and manuals, including Building Peace, Sustainable Reconciliation in Divided Societies, and The Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Building Peace. So it is our pleasure to introduce John Paul Lederach for this year's Notre Dame Student Peace Conference.
Thank you, Cal. I'm very happy to be with you all. Good morning, everyone. It's morning out here on Pacific time. I'm sure it's afternoon for most of you where you're located. I really appreciate this invitation. This conference, the Student-Led Peace Conference, was always one of my favorite spaces. And I don't have as much opportunity to be in the classroom these days, so it's really an honor to share some time with you. Tomorrow is my birthday. I will be 66, and you can see the gray hair. I never quite know when I get one of these invitations whether I should expound on some cutting edge theory, relay best practices that I've learned, or just ramble on, which I'm prone to do, and that you, to be honest, are very likely to suffer no matter what transpires in the coming hour. But I was wondering to myself as we got closer to this time, and maybe because of the birthday, who knows, and the fact that we've been traversing this year plus of quarantines and limited contact and no travel and sort of the nomadic life transposed onto Zoom formats. My wondering into myself was whether or not I had one piece of vocational advice to pass on to the Student Peace Conference. And if I did, what would that piece of advice be? I ended up with this title, A Sauntering Field Trip, The Extraordinary Arc of 1,000 Conversations, plus a few side notes on the way to a peace conference. And I had in mind where I was going to start this conversation. And the more I thought about it, the more I think I do have one piece of advice. And I plan to share it toward the end of this talk, because where I want to start this conversation is with a story that I've been thinking a lot about lately. I've written a few times here and there about it, but been thinking a lot more about it these past weeks. And it goes back about 30 years. So a first small side note to this story. Some conversations really stick. They stay with you in a way that just keeps coming back off and on. It's almost as if that conversation that stuck with you is trying to talk to you. And when they do come back, these sticky conversations, it may be wise to pause and to listen anew each time it comes. Mark Twain once noted that, very interesting phrase for our days right now. Mark Twain once noted that a lie can make its way half around the world before the truth even gets its boots on. And it seems that these days we're having a good bit of trouble getting our boots on. So my side note to the side note, the stickiness I suggest you pause for is when a conversation comes back and is trying to talk to you about some truth that may be trying to catch up with where you're at. And that's what I was experiencing these past weeks. So now back to the story. We were in the outskirts of Hargeisa in the northwest region of Somalia at the time. This would have been around 1990, 30 some years ago. We were having tea, a couple of us internationals and a group of 3 elders and some younger Somali colleagues who were helping to translate. The elders were about to head out on a journey. Their plan was to stop a war and open a conversation. Or maybe it was to open conversation and stop a war. They referred to themselves as a traveling entourage in Somali and Ergeda. And they planned to create smaller, then increasingly larger gathering, or what they referred to as a gurti, a gathering where people could talk it out. I guess you could say these 3 elders were preparing themselves for a field trip. Now, a small note. Since we all come from very different places and experiences of education, a word about field trips in my experience. When I was in grade school, way back when, once or twice a year, we would leave the classroom and head out into the world on a field trip. If we were, say, studying geology, we might go on a rock hounding trip. If we were looking at politics, we might make an adventure off to the capital of the state. I actually don't recall all of those trips in detail. What I recall was the feeling. Getting in a bus, buzzing with noise, eyes wide open. School, to be honest, had just gotten fun. I have a friend in Colombia who always talks about this kind of a moment, this kind of field trip, if you will, with a phrase that stuck with me too. He says in Spanish, si no vas, no ves. If you don't go, you won't see. So a field trip, in some ways, is learning by seeing, learning by feeling, learning by being with. Now, back to Hargeisa. The tea was sweet. The questions were few because the answers were wound with poetry and story, very much in the cultural tradition, that always took a while to unravel. The elders were planning to visit the towns spread across the far east region of the north of the country, and then back across to the far northwest portion of the country. They would drive from major town to major town, but significant portions of their travel would actually be on foot. Embedded in that, there were some stories about camels and the nomadic life and the nature of what they were accustomed to. The sum of their proposal seemed to be this. They would travel. It would take some time. In each place, they would sit and listen. They would hear many grievances. They would ask about the harms experienced. They would ask people to reckon with the harms they had caused, to take responsibility as a community and seek ways to balance what had been broken. They would face some youth with a lot of guns. They would carry none. Our protection will be our age. They knew from the start that one visit would never be enough. They would need to return. Some places they would go back to over and over again. Sometimes they would need to sort out a few conflicts locally before they could address a wider set of issues more widely. I recall one of them sharing a proverb from that day that translated as, "The solution to the problem is more talk." If all went well, things would build toward a great gathering. They said without blinking an eye, that probably would take a few years. They had no written project. They never filled out a log frame. I guess we could say they were taking up a sauntering field trip of 1,000 conversations. At the time, it did not match much of what I had been taught about conflict resolution. Their time frame did not seem to match UN protocols or any of the existing grant-making categories and procedures. Ahmed Farah, the Somali anthropologist who studied this process while it happened and after it had transpired, referred to the entire endeavor as these elders taking up the challenge of feeding the roots of reconciliation. Near the end of our meeting that afternoon, we asked what help they might need. They gave those of us from outside of their country some advice and a sort of request. Stay away, give us time, don't interfere. That was the advice. Maybe we could use some extra rice and petrol. That was the only request. A small side note. When someone speaks to their need, listen to the actual need. This may be harder than it seems. So, as a small rule of thumb, don't mistake external conflict analysis for lived experience. Back to the story. Some years later, this ergera had walked the entire north of Somalia several times over. A great gathering did eventually happen. The great gathering lasted 6 months. That grand gurti, as they called it, ended most of the fighting in the region. And at the same time, they declared their independence from Somalia. Somaliland came into being, though not formally recognized by the international community in particular. All these years later, I'm still learning from this sticky idea about sauntering wisdom facing deep harm and conflict. A small side note. Sauntering has a curious root or etymology, as we call it. Often described by authors, but most notably by the American author Henry David Thoreau, who in his very classic essay on walking trace the origin to a word in French, or actually it's a phrase in French, that came from the time period when people began to take pilgrimages from France toward the Holy Land. And in French, people who were on a pilgrimage, who would be walking toward the Holy Land, would be referred to as traveling à la Sainte Terre, literally to the Holy Land. But the sound of that phrase, à la Sainte Terre, created saunterers, those who are traveling toward the Holy Land. In its best sense, Thoreau noted, these were hardly idle people, but were people who understood the art of walking, and perhaps, as in the case of the elders in Somaliland, the art of walking while threading conversations. Back to my story. What speaks to me 30 years later, reflecting on these artful walkers, who we referred to as wandering elders in the book When Blood and Bones Cry Out, that I wrote with my daughter Angie, who many of you may know personally, was their deep understanding of a deep, decent, meaningful, and restorative conversation in the midst of degradation, violence, and dehumanization. A small side note here. What really do we make of the word conversation? In peace studies, we focus so much more on dialogue, facilitation, negotiation, deliberation, all good and useful concepts. But what of the simple conversation? What distinguishes this word such that it rarely enters the official and professional nomenclature of peacebuilding? When and how did it get dropped? Looking back, I think the wandering elders were about the process of restoring conversation. What our friend Ricardo Esquivia from Montes de Maria in Colombia calls the reencuentro de iguales en desencuentro, the gathering of equals who've fallen out of touch. Well, that's a bit of a liberal translation, but the gathering of equals who have fallen out of touch. This all poses such a powerful question. What does it take to restore conversation? Let me return back to what I've gathered from these elders and the insights that they bring, perhaps in 3 bits of wisdom that I can share with you today. So, interacting with how many times I've been revisited by that afternoon conversation, wisdom number 1 was this, that I heard repeated by them a number of times in their notion of ergeta, the traveling group that goes out. It's basically circulate more than you convene. Convening is probably more the purpose that most of us have in mind when we think about preparing a dialogue, a negotiation, a process that requires buy-in. What does it mean to circulate more than you convene? In fact, from their view, they didn't set out to convene. They chose the purpose of traveling to, rather than the purpose of convening into, as the lifeblood of their process. Convening will always be about wielding some form of power, mostly the power to narrow. By circulating, they chose the power of expansion and presence. Such a simple yet profound shift of mental model. Traveling to begins the shift from individual into collective empathy. Even, we might say, collective compassion. To sit, to see, and to feel the world from the lived experience of whole communities. To sit in the presence of the whole and the wholly affected communities. And in the case of these elders, to do so only with the art and soul of conversation at hand. A small side note. Is circulation and collective empathy perhaps where we face the challenge of the double-cloned dilemma of fragility so often present within peacebuilding? Let me explain what I mean by the double-cloned dilemma of fragility. The most fragile element on the front end of negotiation is the same one found on the back end of implementation of peace agreements. The limits of a process dependent upon representation that has to respond to large-scale collective harm. On the front end, convening must narrow and decide who gets to speak for whom on what. And we know that to be experienced and to be fragile in its construction in most settings of armed conflict and deep violence. On the back end, implementation attempts to draw in those who did not participate while still wielding the power of who gets to decide what to do or not, when, for whom, at what pace, and at what intensity. In both cases, the double clone dilemma carries the fragility of representation, or what some folk call the dilemma of inclusion. A side note on this side note, if you will. I don't think it's the dilemma of inclusion. I think it's the dilemma of coordination. Let me pose it as a question. How do whole collectives achieve common purpose without centralized power or control? How do whole collectives achieve common purpose without centralized power or control? That's not a question I can take credit for. It comes from the field of entomology. Entomologists were trying to sort out this very question in the study of collective insects like termites, ants, and bees. They referred to this as the coordination paradox. How do whole collectives achieve common purpose without centralized power or control? Their conclusion was that it had something to do with circulation. That is, the traveling out and the movement of the communities. As insects circulate, they leave a scent in the landscape, a smell, a scent in the landscape. That is the literal phrase from the entomologist that they referred to as stigmergy, an odd word. So let me explain it just briefly. You know the word stigma as a mark on somebody. Somebody carries a stigma. It may be for something that marked them. It may be for a variety of reasons, from accent to color of skin to whatever else that gets stigmatized in a given society or location. Stigmergy is a mark, a scent, a place noted in the landscape. So it's leaving something in the landscape that other insects would sense, smell, or sense in whatever form they could, and then respond to and build on. In essence, if entomologists were to suggest how to build peace that responded to the double-clone fragility of representation, they might offer this answer: circulate and circulate again. Begin the arc of 1,000 conversations. In every conversation, you will pick something up, and in every conversation, you will leave a scent. It is in the circulating that ideas begin to emerge, cohere, have a sense of purpose and direction. That is the difference between circulating and convening. Now, back to our story. Elder's Wisdom 2 that I gathered that afternoon from the many times I've been visited by this sticky conversation. Where you travel, stay longer with the conversation. Sit with the talk a while, maybe a long, long while. Walk the talk. Have you ever wondered where that phrase came from? Walk the talk. Embodied conversation unfolds the expansive power of presence and patience, from which understanding will eventually emerge, or more likely, converge. A small side note on this one. Let me return to this curious phenomenon that conversation seems a much less explored practice in the nomenclature of peace building. It fell by the way, much like the word befriend, often employed by mediator Adam Curl, fell by the way in professional mediation. The root of the word conversation, however, holds a different story. In the Latin, particularly as employed in the French language, conversation combines the terms con and vers. Basically, the words with and an aspect of turning toward. Turning toward. Or some would say to converse is to turn together. It has an intimacy as a phrase, a familiarity that at times gets translated as actually living with one another. Curiously, in the Old French and in the Middle English, the word conversation carried the primary connotation to dwell with, to live among. Conversation requires us to dwell in the turn, to inhabit, to feel at home in the turning toward and together. Sorry, but I have to add one small side note on this side note. My vocation within peace building has always journeyed alongside the deep challenge of how to restore deeply fractured relationships, or what in the thick and deeper sense of the term might be understood as reconciliation. Yes, the word chosen by Ahmed Farah to describe the wandering elders circulating a threading conversation across Somaliland. While almost nothing can be prescribed or is found to be easy when deep harms abide, or when unrightable wrongs prevail, or when betrayal and loss and injustice last not just years, but across generations. When that level of loss is experienced, perhaps the most difficult aspect is how we turn toward each other and together. In my experience, the turn is both literal and metaphoric. When harm comes in small or large doses, people separate. We move apart. We turn our faces in fear, in anger, in hate, confusion. We give each other our backs. We have that phrase, they gave us their backs. Unless, of course, we feel a need to defend or we choose to attack. But at some point, if the healing is to come, there is this other kind of turn, this other quality of turn that's captured in the word conversation. The turning of the face to find the face of the other, the humanity of even the enemy. At the very same time, this turn remains profoundly internal, because it is not just a turn to see the other. The turning itself reveals one's self. It reveals us. It holds us vulnerable and naked. The turn to which I refer, this quality that is different, is the turn toward transparency, toward responsibility, and ultimately toward rehumanizing. It is the turn toward reckoning and the rawness of our broken humanity. Now back to my elders. Wisdom 3. Everything I heard that afternoon suggested that the elders planned to visit, but always planned to come back. They would do it over and again. They would come back around. That was the plan. Circulate meant going out, going around, coming back again. And each time, bringing something of what they were hearing, picking up something new, leaving something that they had found, and coming back and around and again. Which is why they mused, it will take some years. A small side note. So what if the true meaning of a meaningful conversation requires us to dwell in the turn? The art of circulation while threading a conversation may not have the primary purpose of arriving at conclusion, but to stay with, to persist in our turning together. Sort of like they were saying, the solution to the problem is more talk. Okay. The sticky story is finished. Here's my one piece of advice. Learn to dwell in the turn. Learn to dwell in the turn. Understand and appreciate how our ability to be in conversation really remains that which keeps us human and bound together. Even when those conversations stretch us to the very edge of our patience and tolerance. If you were to ask me how change happens, I think it happens in the arc and spiral of 1,000 conversations. Sometimes those conversations gather and convene, but the real change requires the thread that keeps turning and coming back around again. You may have noticed in this little keynote that my side notes outsized the main body of this talk today. If you ever read it, you will find the side notes are all in bold type. I preferred side notes over footnotes. I think dwelling in the turn requires paying attention to what lies along the journey. It's that quality of alongsideness, what's found at the edges, how the margins hold things that inform not just what we're up to, but the very purpose of what we may be trying to understand. How the edges are the places where voice can gain resonance. How it's the edges that help return us to our humanity that is far too easily lost. We know that these days of quarantine are numbered. Things are starting to open again. We will soon be able to gather in ways that we have not done for the better part of a year or year and a half. You will have your chances for field trips. You may find you appreciate them far more than you had ever imagined. So don't miss a good saunter with a friend or the gift of the chance encounter with the unknown stranger. Drop a scent, pick up a scent, even with the odd enemy. Even with the odd enemy, maybe muster the courage to saunter. Try a tea a month, say for the rest of your life. Persist. Stick. Learn to dwell in the turn. Learn the art of walking while threading a meaningful conversation. I will leave you with a recent haiku. After watching Teacher Spider's work the night before, that I captured the moment I saw a thread in the early morning sun. I wrote haiku throughout most of the quarantine, usually early mornings. Over the course of 14 months, I found that 10 of my haiku fell into a sequenced poem that I called the bucket list. The bucket list while sitting in quarantine. So here is number 8 on my bucket list of 10. Bucket list 8. touch, tenacity. Silk thread stretched from branch to earth, bent by breeze, but grounded on both ends. Silk thread stretched from branch to earth, bent by breeze, but grounded on both ends. May you saunter on, and may you dwell in the turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John Paul, for that incredible conversation. We'll add that to one of the 1,000 conversations that you've had now as well. But as we enter this next phase as well, a Q&A session, I invite all our attendees to submit their questions in the comment section. And as we go through this next section, feel free to ask as many questions as you want. I know we're so blessed to have John Paul with us today, so feel free to send those through. But I was wondering if you could just elaborate maybe a little bit more just on this importance of relationships within these conversations as well. And I think when you touch on that collectiveness that you talk about a lot as well, I think a lot of that can be represented by the African concept of Ubuntu and this collective humanity that we share with one another as well. So just touching on that as well as where you see now in society in this very challenging time, especially when we are socially distanced, socially isolated, how to continue those relationships and really thinking about the critical yeast in relationships as well and the quality of relationships rather than the quantity.
There's a lot in there, Colin, but let me see if I can pull a couple of the pieces. It has been enormously challenging. And I think maybe if there is a big lesson from the quarantine, even for those of us that are more introverted by nature, it is how much our humanity is about our common humanity of sensing and being in the presence of others. Some of us, of course, have had the fortune of being in small family units. That may be the fortune and the curse at times because it's tight. But so we have that. But there's been this deep, I think, almost yearning for having capacity simply to be in the presence of others. Post-vaccination and starting to open up a bit more, it's just amazing what it feels like to sit on a patio and have a coffee and just hear the buzz of actual people around you compared to, particularly from my wife and I, for a number of reasons, in a pretty, sealed down lock-in that we were in. I think that very thing is what I'm after when I talk about the quality of the turn. The notion that the turning is both the turning toward, but it's also the unveiling of being more open to having our common humanity be shared. And that the scariest part of that, of course, is at times of really deep and significant conflict. Those are rife with everything that's carried from the systemic to the personal. And so there's nothing that's easy about that turn. Yet that the very notion of the conversation was one that aimed, at least as I was understanding, and to pick up on your piece in two ways here, that this very small group, I think their entourage probably numbered under 20 or 30 when they first started at most. And it literally was a group of 3 that expanded to a group of 5 elders from different subclans. So they were a small mixed group, very much like the critical yeast, who themselves had come together against the pressure of the divisions that were pushing them apart, and were choosing to go and just spend time in the communities that were most affected by the open fighting that was still ongoing in many parts of the country, and to spend as much time as required. That was their notion of it. So there you have a combination of the critical yeast in some ways, but you also had this commitment and I have not written much about this, but it's something that's on my horizon. Empathy we use so much easier in the concept of individual empathy. I can put myself in the shoes of another. So I want to walk in the shoes of another person, which is certainly a big step and a big window. Collective empathy, it seems to me, is to sit with time to feel and see the world as it is experienced from the life story of whole communities. And that requires ways in which we bring more things to bear. And it certainly requires the ability to stay in the turn, in that conversation, and without necessarily instrumentalizing it, that it's somehow being used to lead to something else. It is about the quality of the presence that is there. So I think that undeniably has a kind of relationship-centric understanding that's a big part of how it unfolds.
I really
I don't know if that got to what you were asking for.
Oh, that's more than I ever could have asked for. And just building off that as well, I think one of the things that really resonates as well, and you write about this in the Moral Imagination as well, is the concept of paradoxical curiosity as well, and sort of finding our space within that. And I just want to read a quick extract from it that talks about the moral imagination is built on a quality of interaction with reality that respects complexity and refuses to fall into forced containers of dualism and either-or categories. As such, this kind of imagination is infused with a paradoxical curiosity. Could you maybe talk a little bit about sort of this paradoxical curiosity in these relationships, and also how we as peace builders trying to find our agency as we involve ourselves within whatever field of peace building that is, how we help find and navigate our way to our agency within with a balance of paradoxical curiosity?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, part of the reason for using the word paradox is that paradox is significantly different than contradiction, though we can tend to mix the two up quite often. Contradiction means that one thing needs to exclude the other. Paradox holds two things that are on the surface seemingly contradictory, but with a different level of distance or depth, may find that they represent aspects of a wider whole that aren't fully visible. And among the complexities that requires us to deal with is that people's lived experience often informs an understanding of what they've seen and heard, and how they've been able to create meaning around that. And that carries a depth of authenticity and truth to it. But it may be quite different than what others have experienced across the divides of our conflicts. And so to have curiosity, this is mostly, in the Moral Imagination, those opening stories were mostly about communities of the kind that I was just describing now, that have been teachers of a lot of this. But I remember in particular the good friends and colleagues from Medio Magdalena in Colombia, the Campesino movement there, that how very much alive they kept their curiosity, that they did not accept sort of quick explanations of things. They needed to travel. They would actually form, although a very different context, a small group that would travel out because they had proposed the idea that they would negotiate with every armed group that affected their community. And they would do that by going out and meeting them. And when they had that kind of curiosity, what it really meant was that they held themselves open. They listened differently. They never backed away from deep principle. They never stepped away from things that they knew to be true, that they wanted also to speak to. but there was a kind of an openness that permitted other sorts of conversations to emerge, other sorts of avenues to become more possible and alive. And of course, in the book, I explore a little bit. I'm fascinated always with where words come from, and curiosity is a curious word, comes basically from a common root to the word care in English, or healing. And in fact, in Spanish, curar, cura, the priest, curar, to heal, curandero, which curandero, you would know, we typically use that, the healing figure within indigenous traditions. These all share a common root with the word curiosity. They trace to the same notion. So to be curious is actually to care. And I think one of the things that we really are struggling with is the driver of binaries, that everything has to be fitted into a kind of an either or, the categorization. And that, I will say, is also true of peace building. We function a lot on the basis of binaries when the challenges we have today are actually somewhere in the blur between. I was just in a conversation, note the word conversation, very powerful for me, with about 90 colleagues from Mexico. It's about 3 weeks ago. And their understanding of their challenges was a challenge to the field of peace building. Because what they were framing was that, and always use their word, the word violence in plural, violences. More people last year were killed in armed conflict in Mexico than were killed in the Afghanistan civil war. But there's no civil war in Mexico because it doesn't fit the binary of what's being described. There are other things that are happening. So their question was, it's a powerful question. What's the relevance of peace building to context of violences when the blurring is so powerful? And it is in the blurring that the system has capacity to repeat itself over and again. And so coming back to your word curiosity, this is where instead of defending, everything should open. we should hold our paradigms lightly and our curiosity widely. And that's a big part of what I think was the notion that I was finding as one of the elements of the moral imagination, was that it's has much greater chance of living as curiosity is supple, open, and held that way as a point of commitment, even in the face of enormous difference.
No, I really appreciate that. And obviously having the root of the word always gives a different perspective on things as well. So we've had a few questions come through from the chat. The first is, what is the sustenance of this peace building approach? It's an approach that seems spiritual in nature, whether that implies religious or not. Is it the spiritual that keeps you going?
I do come from a religious tradition, but I understand much of what I am connecting to here in reference to the question as falling closer to this notion of the spirit. I wrote a smaller book. It's actually free and downloadable PDF wise. So if y'all don't want to purchase any, but by the way, long ago I learned, this was primarily from Latin America, that the success of an author is not how many books they sell, but how many of the books have been photocopied. I have it right here, so let me pull it down. It's titled The Poetic Unfolding of the Human Spirit. If you haven't seen it, you may want to take a look at it. It can be found at the Fetzer Institute's website as a PDF to download. It's a little shorter version in some ways of the moral imagination. But what it touches on is that conflict, when it turns violent, One of the things we found in listening carefully to the everyday language of people coming particularly from more grassroots level communities affected by violence was the kind of language they used both for the impact of violence and the struggle that they had to explain what things transpired that were part of their view of healing. And quite often, this was in the book When Blood and Bones Cry Out, by the way, if you want to go to it more specifically. Quite often they referred to violence as numbing, having a numbing effect, but vibration basically stopped. And the numbing effect was not just the physicality of it, but that something of the human spirit had been destroyed. And equally on the other side, when healing, even in its smallest form, began, it often was in the smallest of vibrations that reignited something of the sense of self and spirit. That was often captured in the phrase, I felt like a person again. And I think there's a deep spirituality that accompanies that, though I would not place it, within the confines of a particular form that it needs to take. It's about reconnecting, with our sense of humanity, like I was saying earlier. And that for me has always been a quest that stays open to those aspects of what's emergent, which is why I've had such an interest in and support for the bridges between peace building and the arts. Because I think the arts often navigate into these spaces in ways that kind of touch us and help us come alive in ways that is not always possible to do when things get disembodied to the level of trying to purely explain it. Because there is much that is unspeakable in what we experience. We will need avenues that open toward those things that help us unleash the human spirit that has been damaged. So I'm not sure if that gets to part of what the person was after, but appreciate the question. And yes, I very much believe in that it's one of the core underpinnings of much of what we work with.
Awesome. And it's great you mentioned the arts and peace building as well. We actually have a session on that tomorrow for anybody who's interested in that. So our next question is from Sophie, who asks, I would love to hear a bit more about the practical application of circulating in peace building processes. Is the approach applicable to international peace building organizations or only to smaller localized cohorts like the example you described?
I think so. If this was Sophie. Sophie, thanks for your question. I think this is very applicable to much wider processes. I actually make the speculation that that I think one of the things we're facing with the biggest challenges for our human species, but also the biggest challenges for peace building, are the ways in which we have to evolve paradigms that are at once local and fractal, more than global. Global would mean that all at once it's everywhere in the sense that it has some kind of overarching capacity to control it. And I think that's true for climate. It's true for the many flows of illicit economies. It's true across issues around human trafficking. It's true around movement of weapons. It's true around the ways that quite often the violences, for example, I was referring to earlier, navigate transnationally. They have obviously places that they try to land, but they don't care so much for the particular location as they care for controlling the flow of the value chain that they want to control. And all of these are going to suggest that our paradigms that assume ways in which we will move mostly in the direction of representation are going to be deeply challenged. And we're going to have to find other ways to achieve that. So in Nepal, for example, to give a concrete one, you might make reference to this as being localized cohorts, but it's actually a national movement around conflicts with regard to use of forest land and water, with what they refer to as user groups, a forest user group federation that numbers almost 1/3 of the adult population of Nepal, while functioning in ways that requires people to be a part of local grounded communities where they're actually engaged. And within that, a set of people that I've worked with for the better part of nearly 14 years that evolved a whole new methodology for handling land, forest, and water conflicts that was based on this circulation model, very much based on, so if you take the web approach that I refer to quite often, the spider understanding, among the keys that you want to watch for is the actual movement of the spider, not so much just looking at the web when it's finished, though it's gorgeous when it's finished. It is the constant movement, and that those movements go to the farthest anchor points where the threads are laid, to the circulation, to the center, to the periphery and back. There are multiple forms of movements that I think we find over and again. I think this is much of what we might use as a descriptor for how social movements are emergent. They're not emergent in centralized ways that are top-down functioning. They are combinations of highly and pragmatically responsive to local challenges, while fractally, that is at expansive or magnitude scale, connected to other places that are involved in the same. And so social movements quite often offer paradigms that are different than, that are more proximate to the circulating motifs than they are to the pure convening motifs. And the bridges between those two, I think, would be a big part of the exploration that we need to pursue. So yes, I think it is. I for one, would make a much stronger case that much more needs to be done constantly and throughout in the circulation model if the convening is to reduce its fragility. And I think that we've been very slow. We rely far too much on representational models when those have proven over and again to be far more fragile than we think they are.
That's great. And the next question we have is, how have you seen the role of storytelling and peace building change in the different projects or processes of which you have been a part?
Elena, thank you for the question. It's so storytelling. So I'm going to say what has been the same first, and that is that story is always present. Story is the way by which we find the capacity to give meaning to what we've lived. And those take the form of story. What changes, I think, is that depending on cultural context, there may be ritual, modalities, and forms that story can take. Whether those more oral societies might have certain ways that they happen. The Somali context that I was referencing actually reveres its poets. And there's reason for that. Poets are often drawn upon at times of conflict between subclans because they dip back into the oral knowledge of poetry that has gone before them in order to bring forward both grievance and proposal. So the actual handling of conflict, poets can play an extraordinary part of that. Whereas, in other contexts, that may not be exactly the case. So I think coming into and watching and listening for the ways and the shape that stories take within a context is one of the extraordinary, most fascinating parts of this. And it can certainly vary by context, but it will always be present.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. So the next question we have is from Seda, who says, can we connect this approach with African storytelling and creating peaceful community under the baobab trees?
Yeah, actually, most of it does happen under a tree. It did in Nepal as well. There are a lot of communities around the world that have designated places and trees that represent the container holding spaces for this, which are, trees are a fascinating part of how this is often a part. A lot of proverbs around this. One that I've been struggling with, which I learned from the Somali friends. So since this was asked about an African context, I could leave it to the Notre Dame Peace Conference to struggle with the meaning of whether this is partially true, a paradox, or a contradiction. But it says this: what old people see seated at the base of a tree, young people can't see from the branches. Now, a word or two about this. This is obviously a revering of wisdom and age, and that even if eyesight is not good, there may be something deep to be drawn on. But it also is about the hardening of ageism, which in many places that I've worked has created deep challenges for the people who are often incited into violence and drawn upon to do it, which more often than not tend to be toward the younger generations. And then when it comes time for the peace side of it, can feel that they're left to their own devices. And of course, as we know, one of the growing edges of much of the work is because we know these situations are so often transgenerational, is the deep question of how to help nurture rising generations in settings that can lead into new ways of being with the deep differences that exist and not repeat the patterns that fall back to violence, which places a great deal of emphasis on the leadership of youth, often at the front edge of peace building, rather than the periphery or the back edge. But to go back to the original question, yes, trees are very significant in an African context, and depending on the location, and actually in many parts of the world, there will be a specificity of where some of that takes place, depending on the occasion and the community need.
Awesome. That's such great insight. And another question that came in here from Josephine talks about maybe talking a little bit about the link between the healing that you talked about and then also the psychology of peace building as well, and how you see those two pieces intersect.
Yeah, well, I would assume that maybe by psychology, in part, we're referring to the ever-growing depth of knowledge around trauma healing, and transgenerational trauma, which has been, I think, among the most significant of the understandings. But also that psychology brings, I think, so much of this combination between psychology and social psychology of how significant perception and the creation of meaning and the choice of response has these processes of what we watch for, how we attach meaning to it, and how we respond to it, which are at the core of much of what happens in conflict, and that are deeply about both narrative and psychology in many regards. I think the healing, obviously the healing side of that is that it requires this process by which we have an ability to become more aware of how the patterns have functioned, how we are a part of those patterns, and to have some capacity for at least a few to step back and begin to ask the questions, how do we make sense of this without falling immediately to the worst case attribution of what's happening. Robert Schreider, who is a good colleague of ours on the theology side of a lot of this work, Catholic professor teaching out of the Catholic Theological Union, wrote in a couple of his books his view that in places where he's worked, a healing for a wider collective will need a few who are healed. He called them a cadre of people who have moved on the pathway toward healing, if others at a wider level are to have that happen. So there is a part of that is a constant process. Just recently, I heard a wonderful colleague from the 8th Ward in Washington, D.C., the far southeast, where we're doing an initiative that has a lot of work around, what's often referred to as violence interruption, credible messengers, people working in places where combinations of deep poverty, systemic racism, and high levels of illicit economies like drugs and guns are ever present, especially in ever increasing lower ages. And her phrase was, hurt people hurt people. Healed people help people. And I think it was just a simple window into what you're asking about, which is that healing is not a once and it's over process. It's about that the healing has a combination of the individual into the collective and the collective back, the facing back into the story of where this has come from and how it keeps showing up, the challenges of unveiling the systems that produce it, the dynamics in particular, over and over again, and the capacity of people when they cohere around a sense that something can be different, can begin to move in the direction of their own healing by having opportunity to be alongside others that they have a sense that they're connecting to in a way that restitches the humanity that's been broken. And that has been a fairly common theme in a lot of places where we've worked. It's not about external peace building nearly as much as it is, and I think Bridget will be talking, maybe she has already, a lot more to this point about the power of local innovation, the embeddedness of the resources proximate to, those most proximate to the suffering are often those most proximate to the healing. And when we understand that, we can begin to understand how the innovation comes in ways that cannot be simply prescribed from outside of it. I don't know if that got to all that was in that wonderful question, but
no, that's great. And I know we're running up close to time, but I think we got one last question here that'd be great if you could cover as well. So this last question is from Rona, who talks about, have you found that technological advances in increasing communication flow as well as social media has influenced the peace building process in more recent times?
Rona, it's a great question. I've been thinking about this a lot because the Zoom, or Socio, whatever this thing is called. What are we on today? First time I'm on Chrome.
Yeah, Socio. You got it.
Socio, yeah, good. And Teams, there's a variety of them. I'm such a Luddite. Every time I got to learn a whole new process that it comes around. But it's what's so amazing is that you can actually be with people that would have great difficulty normally getting together. And you can do that with some regularity. I have a team that I work with that's supporting this notion of youth and peace building in South Sudan. And we meet, a couple hours a week, every week, and one early morning across 3 or 4 continents, actually. The team is, for varieties of reasons, are spread, along with our colleagues who are often able to come in by way of WhatsApp or something that's, available to them from within a more challenged digital situation. And we're finding that there are some extraordinary things that can emerge. We're also finding that it doesn't replace the need to feel more human with each other, present with each other. And we're finding that this format can leave the mind tired. Many of you may know my wife has navigated Parkinson's disease for about 14 years now, and they have a phrase within Parkinson's that I've been understanding better by way of this past year of quarantine from Zoom primarily, which they call cognitive fatigue. The mind just gets tired. And so there is a certain amount that can happen that I think has enhanced it. I know of colleagues in Colombia and some other places that have held some conversations that they think would not have been possible if they were trying to do them in person because of the difficulties they would have had to navigate. But somehow, by way of this format, a few of those were capable of coming forward. The sustenance of that constructive process will have to cross the bridge of being in person if it is to continue. And so you don't get away from the centrality of actual relationships. And I think there's a certain amount that this affords, which I think will probably change the face of some things from here forward. But there is always that deeper humanization that remains at the core of it.
Thank you so much for that. This has been such an awesome conversation. If this is anybody's first time hearing from John Paul, I'm sure it won't be your last as well, because within the field of peace studies, John Paul has continued to show exactly why he's somebody who's continued to pave the way within the field. So a huge thank you to John Paul for joining us today. And we'll also add the link as well to the book that John Paul had mentioned as well. That's available on the Fetzer Institute too. So, and also because you came here today as well, we'll add the little competition as well. If you guys have been following that and tracking that throughout as well, we're going to add it. There you go, JPL Keynote. So good on you for all coming here as well. So for the rest of this afternoon, we'll have a break for the next 30 minutes. Feel free to use the networking rooms or take a break as well, as John Paul talked about. If you want to take a break from that cognitive fatigue, it's okay. It's absolutely go outside. It's nice weather. And after that, we'll come back with 2 sessions, one of which is focused on peace building education in schools and beyond, and the other is approaches to systems of discrimination as well. So thank you so much again, John Paul, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, and bye-bye.